The letter was never finished. It sits in a German military archive, 3 pages of handwriting that begins with the careful penmanship of a man who was trained to be precise and ends on the 3rd page in something that can no longer be called handwriting. The words dissolve, the pressure of the pen against the paper changes, and then somewhere in the middle of a sentence that was trying to say something about home, about the smell of a kitchen, about a face he was trying to hold in his memory against the competition of everything that surrounded him, the letter simply stops. His name was Wilhelm. He was 23 years old. He was a corporal in the German 6th Army, and he was writing from inside what had once been a textile factory on the western bank of the Volga River, in a city that had already been mostly destroyed by the time he arrived in it and would be completely destroyed by the time he left. He wrote, "I no longer know what we are fighting for. The city is rubble. We are fighting for rubble. Men die for individual rooms, for staircases, for the right to stand in a doorway that leads to nothing." And then the letter stops. What stopped it, history does not record. What history does record is the name of the city he was writing from, and the scale of what that city cost, and the question, still unanswered, still uncomfortable, still reverberating through the architecture of the modern world, of whether any of it was worth a single unfinished sentence. The city was Stalingrad, and what happened there was not a battle, it was the place where the Second World War broke in half. By the summer of 1942, Adolf Hitler had made Stalingrad personal. This was not a strategic necessity, though the city's position on the Volga, controlling the river traffic that fed Soviet industry and connecting the oil fields of the Caucasus to the rest of the country, gave it genuine military value. What transformed Stalingrad from an objective into an obsession was the name on its buildings. The city named after Stalin, the symbolic capital of Soviet industrial will. To take it would be to humiliate the man across the table, to drive a stake through the psychological heart of Soviet resistance, to demonstrate to the world that the Third Reich's eastward momentum was not merely military but historical, inevitable, irresistible, the ordained direction of the 20th century. Hitler said, take it at any cost. He did not fully consider in the summer of 1942 what any cost might eventually mean. He would spend the rest of the war learning. To stand in Stalingrad in the autumn of 1942 is to stand inside a new category of human experience, one for which the existing vocabulary of war is almost entirely inadequate. The city that German forces entered in September 1942 had already been bombed into a condition that defied easy description. The Luftwaffe had preceded the ground assault with raids of such sustained intensity that the city's wooden residential districts had been reduced to ash, and the industrial districts to a skeletal landscape of broken concrete and twisted steel that stretched for miles along the western bank of the Volga. The smell that settled over Stalingrad in those weeks was the compound smell of burning, wood, rubber, flesh, the particular acrid signature of a modern city being unmade at industrial scale. And yet the city fought back. Soviet General Vasily Chuikov, commander of the 62nd Army defending Stalingrad, understood something about urban warfare that transformed the ruins from a liability into a weapon. In open country, German combined arms doctrine, tanks supported by infantry supported by aircraft, the entire apparatus coordinated with a mechanical precision that had consumed most of Europe in 2 years, was nearly unstoppable. In the rubble of Stalingrad, that doctrine suffocated. Tanks could not maneuver through streets that no longer existed. Aircraft could not easily distinguish Soviet positions from German ones when both occupied the same building on different floors. Artillery became as dangerous to the attacker as to the defender when the front line was a staircase. Chuikov's solution was brutal in its simplicity: hug the enemy, press Soviet positions so close to German ones that the Luftwaffe could not strike without killing its own men, fight for every room, Every floor, every cellar and rooftop and collapsed wall with the kind of close, grinding, personal violence that reduced the technological advantages of the Wehrmacht to irrelevance and turned the battle into a pure test of will, which was, in the autumn of 1942, a test that the Soviet soldier, fighting on his own soil, in the ruins of his own city, with the Volga at his back and nowhere left to retreat, was prepared to pass at any cost. The Germans called it Rattenkrieg, Rat War, the war of the sewers and the cellars and the spaces between walls where men killed each other in the dark with knives and entrenching tools and their bare hands because there was not enough room to raise a rifle. Every building became a fortress, every floor became a front line. Every dawn revealed a landscape that looked exactly the same as the previous dawn, except for the addition of more bodies and the subtraction of more men who had been alive the day before. It was in this landscape that something happened that the history of Stalingrad tends to mention briefly and then move past, something that deserves to be stopped at, examined, held up against the light and considered for what it actually represents. On September 27, 1942, a Soviet sergeant named Yakov Pavlov led a reconnaissance group of 4 men into a 4-story apartment building on Penzinskaya Street in the center of Stalingrad, overlooking a large square that offered commanding fields of fire in 3 directions. They found approximately 30 Soviet civilians sheltering in the basement. They cleared the German forces from the building, and then, rather than withdrawing as the reconnaissance mission specified, Pavlov sent word back to his commander that the building was worth holding. He was sent reinforcements, 25 men in total, from different units, different nationalities: Russians, Ukrainians, Kazakhs, Georgians, Tatars, Uzbeks, a cross-section of the Soviet Union, thrown together by the logistics of catastrophe and tasked with holding a building that the German command, once it identified the tactical value of its position, through repeated, sustained, heavily supported assaults against for the next 58 days. 25 men, 58 days. They fortified the building with the resources available to them: anti-tank rifles positioned in windows, machine guns covering the approaches to the square, passages knocked through internal walls to allow movement without exposure to fire, the basement connected to the Soviet lines by a narrow communications trench that supplied them with ammunition and food and occasionally additional personnel. They held through artillery bombardments that collapsed sections of the building around them. They held through direct tank fire that opened the exterior walls to the November sky. They held through temperatures that dropped to levels at which exposed metal burns the skin and the act of breathing becomes a physical effort against the cold. General Chuikov would later observe, with a pride that was not exaggeration, that more German soldiers died assaulting Pavlov's building in those 58 days than died in the German army's entire capture of Paris in 1940. 25 men, 1 building, 58 days. This is what Stalingrad actually was, beneath the strategic maps and the operational summaries and the numbers so large they lose human meaning. It was Sergeant Pavlov knocking a hole through a wall at 3 in the morning to reposition a machine gun. It was a Kazakh soldier and a Georgian soldier who did not share a language holding a staircase against the German assault through the medium of shared terror and shared purpose. It was the specific, granular, human-scale heroism of people who had been placed in an impossible situation and had decided collectively and without ceremony that they were not going to move. While Pavlov's men held their building, something was being prepared on the frozen steppe outside Stalingrad that the German Sixth Army's intelligence apparatus had failed, with consequences that would define the remainder of the war to detect. Operation Uranus, the Soviet counteroffensive, planned in secrecy by Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky, approved by Stalin, prepared with a logistical discipline that the German command, which had consistently underestimated Soviet organizational capacity, did not believe the Red Army was capable of.
1 million Soviet soldiers, 1,300 tanks, nearly 13,000 artillery pieces massed on the flanks of the German position around Stalingrad, where the line was held not by German divisions but by Romanian and Italian and Hungarian armies whose equipment and morale were unequal to what was about to hit them. On November 19, 1942, at 5 in the morning, the Soviet artillery opened fire. The sound was heard hundreds of miles away. The ground shook as though the earth itself had decided to participate, and 3,500 guns firing simultaneously drove the opening wedge into the flanks of the Axis position with a violence so total and so sustained that the Romanian Third Army, which received the first assault, essentially ceased to exist as a functioning military organisation within hours. Within 4 days, the 2 Soviet pincers had closed behind Stalingrad. The German Sixth Army, 300,000 men, the most powerful single formation in the Wehrmacht, was encircled, cut off, surrounded by 1 million Soviet soldiers on a frozen steppe in a Russian winter that was already killing men who were equipped for autumn. Hitler refused to allow a breakout. He declared Stalingrad a fortress. He promoted Friedrich Paulus, the Sixth Army's commander, a meticulous, loyal, increasingly desperate man, to Field Marshal, in what was understood by everyone involved as an implicit command: German Field Marshals do not surrender. The promotion was delivered by radio on January 30th, 1943. Paulus surrendered the following day. He was the first German Field Marshal in history to be taken prisoner. The moment he walked out of the ruined basement that had served as his headquarters and into Soviet captivity, something shifted in the architecture of the war that was irreversible, and that everyone who witnessed it understood immediately to be irreversible. Not just a battle lost, not just an army destroyed, something more fundamental than either. Hitler had said, "Take it at any cost." He had not been told what the cost was. He was told now.
The numbers from Stalingrad are large enough to be almost meaningless, which is perhaps why they must be said anyway. Approximately 2 million human beings, soldiers and civilians, German and Soviet and Romanian and Italian and Hungarian, and every other nationality that the war had fed into that particular machine, died in the Battle of Stalingrad and its immediate consequences. The German Sixth Army, 300,000 strong at the moment of encirclement, ceased to exist. 90,000 men marched into Soviet captivity in February 1943. Fewer than 6,000 ever returned to Germany. The others are in the ground of the Russian steppe, in graves marked and unmarked in the cold earth of a country that was not theirs and that received them with the same indifference it has always extended to the ambitions of people who did not understand what they were walking into. But the number that matters most, the number that explains why Stalingrad is not merely a military catastrophe but a historical hinge, is not a count of the dead, it is a direction. After Stalingrad, the German army in the east never conducted a strategic offensive again. After Stalingrad, the momentum of the Eastern Front, which had been flowing with the force and apparent inevitability of geological process from west to east since June 1941, reversed. After Stalingrad, the war began, slowly and at enormous cost, to flow the other way. Wilhelm never finished his letter. He never explained what he could no longer understand about the purpose of what he was doing. But the letter itself, stopped in the middle of a sentence about home, contains an answer of its own. The answer that Stalingrad gave to everyone who asked whether the Third Reich's eastward momentum could be stopped, whether the Soviet Union could absorb punishment on a scale that no nation had ever been asked to absorb and still refused to break, whether the ordained direction of the 20th century was quite as inevitable as it had seemed in the summer of 1942. The answer was written in the ruins of a city on the Volga.
in the held staircase and the unfinished letter and the Field Marshal who walked into captivity and the 6,000 men who came home out of 90,000? The answer was no. The war turned at Stalingrad, and it never turned back.